The starship descended through the golden clouds of Veltharus Prime and Gunnery Sergeant Marcus. Cole pressed his face against the viewport like a child seeing snow for the first time. But his eyes carried the weight of 40 years of warfare, and his hands never strayed far from the long metal case resting across his knees. The Galactic Coalition Academy rose from the alien landscape like a monument to everything humanity had ever dreamed of reaching. And Marcus had spent his entire career fighting just so his species could earn a seat at this table. And now here he was representing all of Earth at the most prestigious military institution in the known universe, Terran vessel. "You are cleared for landing at Platform 7, a voice crackled through the communication system. And Marcus noticed how the alien controller pronounced Terran with the same tone someone might use when discussing an insect that had wandered into their home. He gathered his belongings and secured the metal case with extra care because what lay inside meant more to him than anything else he owned. And when the landing ramp lowered, he stepped out into air that smelled like copper and honey and felt gravity that pulled just slightly harder than Earth. A young officer with blue skin and 3 eyes waited at the bottom of the ramp, and she introduced herself as Lieutenant Vess and explained that she would escort him to his quarters before the orientation ceremony. And Marcus thanked her with genuine politeness that seemed to surprise her. "You are the first human to attend the academy," she said as they walked through corridors made of some crystalline material that hummed with energy. And Marcus nodded because he already knew this fact better than anyone, since the weight of that responsibility had kept him awake for many nights. The quarters they gave him were simple but clean and larger than any room he had occupied during his military career. And after Lieutenant Vess departed, he sat on the bed and opened the metal case with the reverence of a priest handling sacred relics. Inside lay a rifle that his grandfather had carried and his father had carried, and now he carried a weapon of wood and steel and iron sights that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a military academy. And he ran his fingers along the worn stock and remembered every story his family had told about this gun orientation ceremony. Took place in a massive hall filled with cadets from dozens of species, and Marcus had never seen so many different forms of intelligent life gathered in one place. And he stood near the back holding his case while creatures of crystal and shadow and living flame took their seats. Senior Instructor Thalvex was a Korathi who stood nearly 3 meters tall with 4 arms and skin that looked like ancient leather stretched over stone. And when he spoke, his voice filled the hall without any need for amplification, because his species had evolved to communicate across vast distances. "You represent the finest warriors your civilizations have produced," the instructor declared, and his eyes swept across the assembled cadets with an intensity that made even the largest species shrink back. "And over the next cycle, you will learn from each other and grow stronger together and forge bonds that will serve the coalition for generations." Marcus listened carefully and took mental notes and tried to ignore the curious stares directed his way because he was obviously the strange one here with his soft skin and single pair of arms and a mysterious Casey refused to sit down after the ceremony. The cadets gathered in the weapons familiarity hall where long tables displayed the armaments of every coalition species. And Marcus watched in genuine amazement as plasma lances and graviton cannons and antimatter projectors were demonstrated and explained. A Krethver cadet named Varks approached Marcus with the clicking sound and his crystalline exoskeleton made with every movement. And his multifaceted eyes reflected Marcus like 1,000 tiny mirrors as he looked down at the human with obvious curiosity. "You are the Terran," Vorik stated rather than asked. and his mandibles clicked in a pattern that Marcus would later learn indicated amusement. "We have heard much about your species, and how you fought your way to coalition membership through sheer stubbornness. That is one way to describe it," Marcus replied with a slight smile. And he shifted the weight of his case from one hand to the other. "What weapon have you brought to demonstrate the might of Terra?" Vorix asked. And several other cadets gathered around, because they too wanted to see what the mysterious newcomer had been carrying since his arrival. Marcus set the case on a nearby table and unlatched the clasps with deliberate slowness, because he knew what was coming and had prepared himself for this moment during the entire journey from Earth. And when he lifted the lid, the gathered aliens leaned in with anticipation. Laughter started with Vorix and spread through the crowd like fire through dry grass. And soon the entire hall echoed with the sounds of mockery in a dozen different languages and frequencies that humans could not even hear. "A chemical propellant weapon," Vorix managed to say between clicks of amusement. "The humans have brought a museum artifact to the most advanced military academy in the galaxy. A Silith cadet with scales that shimmered like oil on water slithered closer and examined the rifle with her heat-sensing pits. And she hissed something that translated as, 'My ancestors used more advanced weapons before we discovered fire.' Marcus said nothing as he lifted the rifle from its case and began the familiar ritual of cleaning and checking that his father had taught him and his grandfather had taught his father. And his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed these actions thousands of times. "Does it even work?" asked a Moktai cadet whose forearms were crossed in a gesture of disbelief. "Or is it purely ceremonial like the primitive clubs some species display?" "It works," Marcus said quietly without looking up from his task. And something in his tone made a few of the cadets stop laughing, though most continued their mockery. Vorix reached out with one crystalline claw and tapped the wooden stalk with a sound like glass striking glass. And he shook his head in what passed for pity among his kind. "Perhaps the humans are not ready for the coalition after all," he declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "If this is the best weapon they could send, then perhaps they should return to their little blue world and practice with sticks and stones for a few more centuries." The laughter rose again, and Marcus finished his cleaning and placed the rifle back in its case with the same care a parent might use when laying a child to sleep. And he closed the lid and latched the clasps and finally looked up at the crowd of mocking faces. "This rifle has a name," he said in a voice that carried despite its quietness. And something in his eyes made the nearest cadets take an unconscious step backward. "My family calls it patient, because it has waited a very long time to prove what it can do." He picked up the case and walked through the crowd that parted before him and left the hall without another word, while behind him the aliens exchanged glances and resumed their laughter, though perhaps with slightly less certainty than before in his quarters. That night Marcus sat by the window and watched the alien stars wheel overhead, and he spoke to the rifle, as he had done since childhood. "Not yet, old friend," he whispered. "But soon they will understand, and then they will never laugh again." The weeks that followed were difficult for Marcus in ways he had not expected, because while he had prepared himself for mockery, he had not prepared for the loneliness that came with being the only human on a world full of aliens who saw him as little more than a curiosity. Every morning he woke before the artificial dawn and ran through the academy grounds while the other cadets slept, and his boots pounded against paths designed for creatures with claws and tentacles and hooves. And he pushed his body harder than he had since his youth, because weakness was not something he could afford to show. The academic courses proved easier than the social challenges, because Marcus had always been a student of war and tactics, and the instructors soon recognized that the human understood combat in ways that went beyond mere technical knowledge. and his scores and strategy simulations began to climb until even Vorax could not deny his competence. The Terran fights like a cornered animal. Vorax commented one day after watching Marcus dominate a tactical exercise. And though the words were meant as an insult, Marcus accepted them as a compliment because cornered animals were the most dangerous kind. The rifle became a constant source of jokes throughout the academy, and cadets from species Marcus had never even seen would approach him just to ask about the stick, as they had come to call it. And some would pretend to be afraid of the primitive weapon while their friends laughed at the performance. Marcus endured it all with patience that surprised even himself, because his instructors back on Earth had warned him that this would happen and had made him promise to control his famous temper. And every night he cleaned the rifle and whispered to it and reminded himself that patience was a weapon too. One evening in the common area, a group of cadets decided to take their mockery further than usual. And they surrounded Marcus while he ate his meal and began to ask questions designed to humiliate him in front of the largest crowd possible. "Tell us, Terran," a Velthari cadet with skin like polished marble demanded. "Do your people still believe in magic and spirits and other primitive superstitions?" "Some do," Marcus answered calmly without stopping his meal. "And some believe in science, and some believe in both because humans are complicated that way." "And this rifle," another cadet chimed in, "does it contain the spirit of your ancestors, or perhaps a small god who grants wishes to those who rub its stock?" The laughter that followed was loud and cruel, and Marcus felt his hands tighten around his eating utensils. But he forced himself to relax and took another bite and chewed slowly, while the mockery washed over him like rain. "The rifle contains nothing but metal and wood and the memories of everyone who carried it before me," he said after swallowing. "And that is more than enough." Vorax pushed through the crowd with his crystalline body, catching the light in ways that made him look like a walking sculpture. And he stood over Marcus with an expression that mixed contempt with genuine curiosity. "I've studied your species," Vorax declared, "and I know that humans once ruled their world through violence and aggression, and that you nearly destroyed yourselves many times with your primitive weapons before you finally learned peace." "That is true," Marcus admitted, because there was no point in denying the history of his people. "Then why?" Vorax continued while gesturing at the case that sat beside Marcus, as it always did. "Do you cling to this relic of your violent past when you could embrace the future that the Coalition offers?" Marcus set down his utensils and looked up at Vorax with eyes that had seen friends die and enemies fall and worlds burn. And for a moment the Krethver saw something in those eyes that made his exoskeleton rattle with involuntary unease. "Because the future is uncertain," Marcus said quietly. "But this rifle has never let my family down." The moment passed and the laughter resumed, and Marcus finished his meal and returned to his quarters. But that night he did not clean the rifle because his hands were shaking too much with suppressed rage. The announcement came 3 days later that the combined arms exercise would take place at the end of the week. And this was the event that every cadet had been anticipating since the beginning of the training cycle, because it was their chance to demonstrate the power of their species. Weapons. Marcus read the rules carefully and learned that each cadet would have the opportunity to fire their weapon at a series of targets designed to test different aspects of military technology. And the targets would increase in difficulty until they reached materials that could withstand direct hits from starship cannons. "You should sit out this exercise," Lieutenant Vess suggested when she found Marcus studying the target specifications in the library. "No one would think less of you for recognizing that your weapon cannot compete." "Thank you for your concern," Marcus replied with genuine appreciation for her kindness. "But I will participate. The final target is compressed neutronium alloy," she said with worry in her 3 eyes. "It is rated to survive anything short of a stellar explosion, and your rifle fires simple metal projectiles." "I know what my rifle fires," Marcus said with a small smile that seemed to worry her even more. The day of the exercise arrived with ceremony and fanfare, and the entire academy gathered at the weapons range to watch the cadets demonstrate the might of their civilizations. And Marcus stood at the back of the line holding his case while the other cadets laughed and pointed and placed bets on how badly the human would embarrass himself. Oryx went first, and his plasma lance burned through the initial targets with ease and left glowing craters in the intermediate targets, and actually managed to scorch the surface of the neutronium block, though it did not penetrate. And the crowd cheered for the impressive display. One by one, the cadets took their turns, and the weapons of a dozen species filled the air with energy and fire and destruction. And the neutronium block accumulated scars and burns and discolorations, but remained fundamentally intact, just as it had been designed to do. When Marcus finally approached the firing line with his rifle, the crowd grew quiet with anticipation because everyone wanted to see just how pathetic the human weapon would prove to be. And Vorax positioned himself at the front where he would have the best view of the coming humiliation. But before Marcus could raise his rifle, a voice cut through the silence. Like a blade through flesh. Stop, commanded Senior Instructor Thalvex, and his 4 arms were raised in a gesture that every species recognized as a demand for immediate attention. Before the human fires, I must speak. The ancient Karathi walked toward Marcus with steps that shook the ground, and his eyes were fixed on the rifle with an expression that no one had ever seen on his weathered face. It was fear. The silence that fell over the weapons range was unlike any silence Marcus had experienced before, because it was the silence of hundreds of beings holding their breath at once. And even the wind seemed to pause as Senior Instructor Thalvex approached with his ancient eyes locked on the rifle. Do you know what you hold? The instructor asked in a voice barely above a whisper. And yet somehow every being in the crowd could hear him perfectly. I know exactly what I hold, Marcus replied. And for the first time since arriving at the academy, he allowed a hint of steel to enter his voice. Oryx clicked his mandibles in confusion and stepped forward with the arrogance of youth that has never faced true danger. And he gestured dismissively at the rifle. It is a primitive chemical weapon, Vorax declared. We have all seen it and we've all laughed at it, and surely you are not suggesting that we should fear a stick that throws metal pellets. Thalvex turned to face Vorax with a slowness that spoke of barely contained anger. And when the instructor's eyes met the Krethver cadet, the young alien actually took a step backward. I have lived for 700 years, Thalvex said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries. I have watched empires rise and fall, and I have seen weapons that could crack moons and shatter stars, and I have witnessed the extinction of species who thought themselves invincible. He paused and looked around at the gathered cadets who stood frozen in place. And in all my years, I have never feared any weapon the way I fear what that human carries. The words hung in the air, and Marcus felt something shift in the atmosphere around him as the cadets began to look at his rifle with new eyes. And even Vorax had lost his confident posture. Come, Thalvex commanded. All of you will follow me to the lecture hall, because this lesson cannot wait, and ignorance of this matter could cost you your lives. The cadets followed in stunned silence, and Marcus walked beside the instructor with his rifle case in hand. And he could feel the stares on his back like physical pressure as hundreds of aliens tried to understand what was happening. The lecture hall was a vast space designed to accommodate species of every size, and holographic projectors lined the walls ready to display whatever information the instructor required. And when everyone had taken their places, Thalvex stood at the center of the room and activated the system. What do you know of human history? He asked the assembled cadets. And the question seemed simple, but his tone suggested that the answer would be anything. But a Silith cadet raised her tail in the gesture. Her species used to request permission to speak, and when the instructor nodded, she offered. What she knew: humans are a young species who developed technology rapidly and nearly destroyed themselves with nuclear weapons before achieving unity and joining the galactic community. That is the sanitized version, Thalvex replied. The version that humans allow the coalition to teach because it makes them seem less threatening. He waved one of his 4 hands, and the holographic display came to life with images that made several cadets gasp in horror. And Marcus recognized scenes from Earth's history that most humans preferred to forget. Humanity has been at war with itself since the moment they climbed down from their trees. The instructor continued. And unlike most species who develop weapons to hunt or defend against predators, humans developed weapons specifically to kill each other more efficiently. The images showed ancient battlefields covered with bodies and medieval sieges that lasted for years and modern conflicts that scarred entire continents. And through it all, the evolution of human weapons was displayed in terrible detail. Most species discover energy weapons and abandon kinetic technology, Thalvex explained, because energy weapons are cleaner and easier to control and scale, and they do not require physical ammunition. He zoomed the display to show a comparison of weapon development across different civilizations. The Kreth were abandoned kinetics 40,000 years ago when they developed their plasma technology. And the Silith never developed kinetics at all because their acid-based weapons proved more effective. And the Moktai transitioned to graviton manipulation almost immediately after achieving spaceflight. But humans, he said, and his voice dropped to something that sounded almost like dread. Humans never stopped developing kinetic weapons even after they mastered every other form of destruction. The display changed to show technical specifications that Marcus recognized from classified briefings he had attended back on Earth. And he realized with some surprise that the coalition knew far more about human weapons than his government believed. Chemical propellants became magnetic acceleration, which became gravitational manipulation, which became quantum tunneling, Thalvex continued. And at every step, humans asked the same question that no other species thought to ask. He paused for effect, and the silence was absolute. How can we make the projectile go faster? Vorax finally found his voice and asked the question that everyone was thinking. But why does speed matter when energy weapons can deliver unlimited power? Because energy can be blocked. Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the hall, and every eye turned to him. Shields and armor and countermeasures can stop plasma and lasers, and even antimatter if you have the right technology. He lifted his rifle case and set it on the table before him. But you cannot stop mass, he continued. You cannot negotiate with momentum, and you cannot build a shield strong enough to deflect an object moving at sufficient velocity because the math does not allow it. Thalvex nodded gravely, and the display changed to show a single bullet next to a series of equations that made the mathematically inclined cadets grow pale. A standard human kinetic round fired from a modern military rifle impacts with more force than our plasma lances deliver, the instructor said. And their specialized ammunition makes our fleet weapons look like toys. The weapon the human carries is an antique by their standards, Thalvex added. A family heirloom that is centuries old, and yet I suspect it has been modified with modern human technology. Marcus opened the case and lifted the rifle for all to see. And in the light of the lecture hall, it looked exactly as primitive as it had always looked. My grandfather modified it, Marcus admitted. And my father modified it further, and I have made my own improvements over the years. And what can it do now? Thalvex asked in a voice that suggested he already knew. The answer, and feared at Marcus, met the instructor's eyes and saw understanding pass between them. Enough, he said simply. It can do enough. The lecture hall remained silent as Marcus held the rifle before the assembled cadets. And for the first time since his arrival, they looked at the weapon not with mockery, but with the beginning of understanding. "I would like to make a request," Marcus said to senior instructor Thalvex, and his voice carried the formal tone of a soldier addressing a superior officer. "Speak." The ancient Korethi replied. "Allow me to demonstrate what this rifle can do," Marcus said, "because words alone will not convince them, and they deserve to understand what humans are capable of." Thalvex considered the request for a long moment, and his 4 hands moved in patterns that suggested deep thought. And finally, he nodded with obvious reluctance. "The weapon's range has safety protocols designed to contain energy discharges," the instructor said. "But I do not know if they will contain what you are about to unleash." "I will use a reduced charge," Marcus assured him. "Enough to demonstrate without destroying your facility." The cadets filed back to the weapons range with none of the excitement they had displayed earlier. And instead of laughter and jokes, there were whispered questions and nervous glances at the human who walked among them with his ancient rifle. Marcus took his position at the firing line, and a Nadramon block sat at the end of the range, still bearing the scars from the earlier demonstrations. And he knew that what he was about to do would change how every species in this academy viewed humanity forever. "The round I am loading is not standard ammunition," Marcus explained as he reached into a pouch on his belt and withdrew a single cartridge that gleamed with an inner light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "What is that?" Vorax asked, and for once there was no mockery in his voice, only genuine curiosity mixed with growing fear. "This is what my people call a sleeper," Marcus replied. "It is a kinetic payload delivery system that uses quantum acceleration to increase velocity after firing." He slid the round into the chamber with a smooth motion that spoke of decades of practice. "When I fire this round, it will leave the barrel at a relatively slow speed," he continued. "But once it clears the weapon, the internal systems will activate and it will begin to accelerate." "How fast?" a Moktai cadet asked, with all 4 of her arms wrapped around herself in a gesture of self-comfort. "The round I am using today is limited to 1% of its maximum potential," Marcus said, "because anything more would be dangerous for everyone within 100 kilometers. He raised the rifle to his shoulder and sighted down the iron sights that his great-great-grandfather had used to hunt deer in forests that no longer existed. At full power, this single round could accelerate until it reached a significant fraction of light speed, he said. And at that velocity, even a tiny piece of metal carries enough energy to reshape geography. Thalvex raised one hand and activated a shield barrier around the range that Marcus had not seen used during any of the previous demonstrations. "I am engaging our maximum containment protocols," the instructor announced, "and I strongly suggest that everyone who is not essential to this demonstration take cover behind the blast walls." Most of the cadets retreated, but Vorax remained standing at the observation point with his crystalline body rigid with tension. And Marcus respected the Krethver for having the courage to watch firing. Marcus announced in the calm voice that soldiers throughout history had used before unleashing destruction. He squeezed the trigger. The sound was almost disappointing compared to the plasma blasts and energy discharges that had filled the range earlier. Just a sharp crack that echoed once and faded. But what happened next was anything but disappointing. The round left the barrel and seemed to hang in the air for a fraction of a second to force something inside it awakened. And Marcus watched as the tiny projectile began to glow with a blue-white light that grew brighter with each passing moment. It struck the neutronium block and did not stop. The round passed through the supposedly indestructible material as if it were made of paper, leaving a perfectly circular hole that glowed red with heat. And it continued through the reinforced wall behind the target, and the secondary containment barrier, and the tertiary safety system alarms began to sound throughout the Academy. The round has embedded itself in the planetary defense grid, Thalvex announced as he checked his communication device. It penetrated 17 meters of military-grade armor before the failsafe activated and shut down its acceleration. The cadets emerged from behind the blast walls with expressions that ranged from disbelief to terror. And Voryx walked slowly towards the neutronium block and placed one crystalline hand against the hole that had been punched through it. "This is impossible," he whispered. "Nothing penetrates compressed neutronium, and certainly not a simple metal projectile. The projectile is not simple," Marcus said as he lowered the rifle and began the automatic process of clearing the chamber. "It contains technology that my species has been developing for over 1,000 years, and we have become very good at throwing things at full power," Thalvex said to the assembled cadets. "That round would not have stopped at the planetary defense grid. It would not have stopped at the planet's core, and it would not have stopped until it ran out of energy or hit something massive enough to absorb the impact. A single bullet," the instructor continued, "fired from what you called a primitive stick could crack the crust of a world and trigger extinction-level geological events." Marcus secured his rifle and looked at the faces around him and saw that the mockery was gone forever, replaced by something that he had seen many times in his career when enemies realized what they were truly facing. The Galactic Coalition limited the weapons that humanity could bring to this academy, he said, and they specifically banned our military-grade equipment because they feared what might happen if it fell into the wrong. They feared what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands. He patted the rifle with genuine affection. "So I brought a family heirloom instead," he continued. "An antique that my grandfather used to hunt animals and my father used to defend our home, and I have used to protect everything I love. And if this is what your antiques can do," Voryx said slowly, "then what can your modern weapons achieve?" Marcus smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. "Our modern rifles can crack continents," he said simply. "Our artillery can shatter moons, and our ships carry weapons that we have never used because we are afraid of what would happen if we did." He let that truth settle over the crowd like a heavy blanket. "Humanity is friendly," he added, "and we want peace and cooperation, and we genuinely believe in the mission of the Coalition." He paused, and his eyes swept across every face in the crowd. "But we are very, very good at war." The days that followed the demonstration were different in ways that Marcus had not anticipated, and the change began immediately after he lowered his rifle and faced the stunned crowd of alien cadets who had just watched their assumptions about humanity crumble like the neutronium block. No one laughed anymore. Repair crews worked through the night to fix the damage that a single reduced power round had caused, and Marcus heard that the planetary defense grid would need 3 weeks to return to full operation because his bullet had fused several critical components into Slag's senior instructor. Thalvex called Marcus to his office the morning after the demonstration, and the ancient Karathi sat behind a desk covered with holographic reports and communication requests from a dozen different governments. "You have caused quite a disturbance," the instructor said. But his tone carried no anger, only a weary acceptance of facts that could not be changed. "I apologize for the damage," Marcus replied. "I calculated the power level to minimize harm, but the Coalition materials were not as strong as I expected." "That is not the disturbance I am referring to," Thalvex said with a gesture toward the communications that filled his desk. "Every government in the Coalition is demanding information about human weapons technology, and several are calling for restrictions on your species, and a few are quietly asking if humanity would consider selling them kinetic weapons." Marcus remained silent because he had expected something like this and had been briefed on how to respond. The coalition has always known that humans were dangerous. The instructor continued, but we believed we understood the nature of that danger, and we thought we had contained it by limiting the weapons you could bring to joint exercises and diplomatic functions. He leaned forward with an intensity that made Marcus feel like a specimen under a microscope. We did not understand, Thalvex admitted. We thought your kinetic technology was a curiosity and a sign of primitive thinking, and we never imagined that you had advanced it so far beyond anything we had conceived. My people prefer it that way, Marcus said carefully. We learned long ago that being underestimated is a tactical advantage. The instructor nodded slowly, and something that might have been respect flickered in his ancient eyes. You may return to your classes, Thalvex said, and I suspect you will find the other cadets much more interested in learning from you than laughing at you. The prediction proved accurate in ways that surprised even Marcus, because when he entered the common area that evening, he found a crowd of cadets waiting for him. And at the front of that crowd stood Vorax with his crystalline body reflecting light in patterns that Marcus had learned to associate with nervousness. Terran, Vorax began, and his voice lacked all of the arrogance that had characterized their previous interactions. I wish to speak with you. Then speak, Marcus replied as he set his rifle case on a nearby table. I was wrong about you, and I was wrong about your weapon, and I was wrong about your species, Vorax said, and the words seemed to cost him physical effort because his exoskeleton creaked with tension. I mocked what I did not understand, and I behaved with the ignorance of a child who has never seen the universe beyond his own small world. The other cadets watched in silence as the proud Krethfer humbled himself before the human he had ridiculed for weeks. I ask for your forgiveness, Vorax concluded, and I ask for the opportunity to learn from you as I should have done from the beginning. Marcus studied the alien before him and saw genuine remorse in the way his multifaceted eyes refused to meet the human's gaze. And he remembered being young and proud and making similar mistakes. There is nothing to forgive, Marcus said, and he meant it. You saw a strange creature with a strange weapon, and you reacted as your instincts told you to react, and there is no shame in that. He reached out and placed a hand on Vorax's crystalline shoulder, and the Krethfer flinched at the contact, but did not pull away. The shame would be in refusing to learn. Marcus continued, and you have shown that you are willing to learn, and that is all I could ever ask. The tension in the room dissolved, and the other cadets began to approach with questions and requests for demonstrations and offers of friendship that had been absent throughout the previous weeks. And Marcus found himself at the center of attention for reasons that had nothing to do with mockery. Later that night, when the crowd had dispersed, and Marcus sat alone in his quarters, cleaning his rifle, a knock at his door announced an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Vess stood in the corridor with her 3 eyes blinking rapidly in the way that her species used to express uncertainty. May I enter? She asked, and Marcus stepped aside to welcome her. I wanted to thank you, she said as she examined the rifle that lay in pieces on his desk, for showing restraint during the demonstration. Restraint, Marcus repeated with a slight smile. You could have done so much more, Vess said. You could have destroyed the entire range, or perhaps damaged the academy itself, and no one could have stopped you because we did not understand what we were dealing with. Destruction was never my goal, Marcus replied as his hands continued the familiar work of reassembling his weapon. My goal was understanding, and I believe I achieved it. The other cadets fear you now, Vess observed. Fear is better than contempt, Marcus said. But respect is better than fear, and I hope that in time they will learn to see me as a colleague rather than a threat. He finished assembling the rifle and held it up to examine his work in the light. My grandfather told me something when he gave me this rifle, Marcus said. He said that the weapon itself is neither good nor evil, and that its purpose is determined by the one who holds it. He set the rifle down and looked at Vess with eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too much. Humans have the power to destroy, he said. But we choose to build instead, and we choose to protect, and we choose to reach out to species like yours in friendship rather than conquest. And if someone threatens what you have built, Vess asked quietly. Marcus smiled, and it was the smile of a warrior who had found peace but never forgotten how to fight. Then we remind them why the galaxy learned to fear the sound of thunder, he said, and we hope they are wise enough to listen. He walked Vess to the door and bid her good night and then returned to his window where the alien stars wheeled overhead in patterns that humans were only beginning to understand. We did good today, old friend, he whispered to the rifle that lay on his desk. We taught them something important, and we did not have to hurt anyone to do it. The rifle sat silent in the starlight, but Marcus could have sworn that the worn wood of the stock seemed warmer than usual, as if the weapon itself approved of how the day had ended. Outside his window, the academy slept, and cadets dreamed of kinetic weapons and impossible physics and a species that had mastered the simple art of throwing things so completely that even the stars had learned to be afraid. And somewhere in the depths of space, a coalition council convened an emergency session to discuss the human problem and what to do about a species that smiled and offered friendship while carrying weapons that could crack worlds. The answer they reached was the same answer that enemies of humanity had reached throughout history: make friends with them and pray they never have a reason to become enemies, because nothing in the universe could stop a human who had decided to throw something at you. Nothing at all.